All right, let's take a look at the Los Angeles Rams and see what did they do during the 2018 offseason, both in free agency and the draft. And I will tell you in advance, they had a big offseason this year. Let's see what exactly did they do. Well, first of all, let's look at what their cap situation was. They had $45 million at the beginning of the offseason. By August, they were down to $3.2 million. So, they spent a lot of money, and we're going to talk about how they spent it in just a minute. But they did have a busy offseason this season, or this summer. I want to first review some of the guys that I thought at the beginning of the offseason that might get cut. All right, was I right or was I wrong? And these aren't guys that I thought were definitely going to get cut. These are guys that I thought might get cut. All right. So the first one was Tavon Austin. That was a guy that I thought was in pretty big danger, simply because they had given him a pretty big contract, but yet he just wasn't producing a lot of yards. And in fact, look, he had 509 receiving yards in 2016 to go with 159 rushing yards. But he was expected to be a receiver. But then they were using him as a running back at times on all kinds of different gadget plays and things. You can see his yards per carry has always been solid. Okay, but primarily he was expected to be a receiver, which is why he had 473 yards receiving, 52 catches, 58 catches in 2016. But then, with the new coach in, they decided to try him as a full-time running back. He ended up with 270 yards, 4.6 yards a carry, but they just decided that it wasn't worth it to keep him. They restructured his contract and avoided the last year or 2 years of the contract. So 2018 was going to be the last year of his deal. And instead, the Rams decided to trade him to Dallas. They saved $1 million this season by trading him. He was behind Todd Gurley. They decided that it didn't make sense to keep him anymore. So Tavon Austin was sent to Dallas. He will not be with the Rams next season. Mark Barron is another guy who I thought might get cut. You can see he still had 86 tackles and 6 tackles for a loss, but did not have the kind of seasons that he'd had in previous years. In 2015, that last year in St. Louis, 116 tackles and 18 tackles for a loss. It's unbelievable. In 2016, he still had triple-digit tackles, 118. Last year, it started to fall down a little bit. Had 86 tackles and 6 tackles for a loss. It would save $7 million if they cut him this season, and even bigger amounts in the next 2 years. He really struggled against the run, which is one of the reasons why the Rams had such a poor run defense last season. He's getting up in age, 29 years old. I thought Mark Barron was a big risk of getting cut. So far, it looks like they're going to bring him back. But I'm sure they're keeping a close eye on him in training camp and in the preseason. See what kind of shape he's in and how much he's able to really contribute on the field. Robert Quinn was another guy that I thought might get cut. Maybe just because, he had such a big salary at $10.5 million. It would save $10.5 million if they cut him, and then in the next year it would save $12.9 million. So that was a guy I thought, wow, he might get cut. potentially. If you look at his numbers in 2012 through 2014, in 2013 he had 19 sacks. Unbelievable. And then in 2014 he had 10.5 sacks. But then the next 2 years, he missed a lot of games. He missed 8 games in 2015, 7 games in 2016. Tackle numbers dropped a lot. Sack numbers dropped. Now, last year he bounced back a little bit. Last year he had 32 tackles, 8.5 sacks. But, it's just, for a guy that's getting paid, 10 plus million a year, he's going to be on the bubble. And he obviously was, because they traded him to Miami. So he'll be probably a 4-3 defensive end in Miami. Kayvon Webster. Okay. Webster. Final year of his deal, they were able to save $3.6 million. I think if he had not torn his Achilles, the Rams would have brought him back. For sure. For a guy that started at corner last year, $3.6 million, not bad, but these guys, when they tear their Achilles, some of them, they just never can be the player they used to be. Now let's look at the unrestricted free agents. Okay, the unrestricted free agents, the guys that could sign with any team with no compensation or anything necessary to be given to the Rams. With restricted free agents, you can put a second round tender on a guy, pay him like $2.9 million, and then it makes it really difficult for another team to touch him because they have to give up a second round pick. But with unrestricted free agents, they can sign with anybody. So Sammy Watkins was the biggest name among the offensive players who were unrestricted free agents. You can see he was playing that final year of his rookie contract. He had 593 yards and 8 touchdowns. Not bad after he missed half of 2016 with a broken foot. 8 touchdowns is really solid. Didn't have the kind of yards that he did, prior to breaking his foot when he put up, an average of 1,000 yards his first 2 seasons. LA elected to let him walk, which they gave up a lot to get him. So, I think they gave up a first-round pick, or maybe a second-round pick. But they gave up a lot to get a guy for just 1 year and then him walk away. But he signed a 3-year deal with the Chiefs worth $48 million. Huge deal. $16 million a year. That's number 1 wide receiver money. So we'll see. I think that's a good deal by the Chiefs, actually. All of the news has been out of the Chiefs camp that, Sammy Watkins looks incredible. So, but I also don't think it was a mistake for LA to necessarily let him walk. It's tough to say. Very, very tough to say. The big thing will be to compare how Sammy Watkins does in the future to how Brandon Cooks does. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. John Sullivan was a free agent. He was a center, played solid last year, and great value because he played on a 1-year, $1 million deal. And as you can see, even though he's 33 years old, he played so well that he got a big raise. 2 years, $10.75 million to return. So John Sullivan played himself into a nice payday as he enters into the final years of his NFL career. Defensive unrestricted free agents. Tremaine Johnson was the big name. He was franchised the last 2 years. They just couldn't agree on a long-term deal, and the Rams kept wanting to see, if he would prove it. And basically he did. Last year he got paid $16.7 million and was a former third-round pick. Played well enough that the Jets gave him 5 years and $72.5 million. Big contract. More than $14 million a year. So Tremaine Johnson earned his keep, had a really good season with the Rams, but he won't be back next season. LaMarcus Joyner was a great player. They converted him from corner to safety. He had a big year in Wade Phillips' defense there as a free safety. Finished his rookie contract, was a second-round pick in 2014. So, they had high hopes when they drafted him, and they tagged him. So he will be back for at least one more year with LA, but he'll make a nice little chunk of change, $11.2 million. It's a big raise on a rookie, from his rookie contract. But we'll see what happens after this year. But great payday for LaMarcus Joyner, $11.2 million. But certainly he's hoping for a lot more in a long-term deal. Connor Barwin as another free agent on the defense, linebacker. You can see his numbers there. Had a huge year in 2014 with the Eagles, 14.5 sacks and 64 tackles. But the last couple years hasn't had the same kind of numbers, 34 tackles, 5 sacks. He's a 3-4 outside linebacker. He was playing on a 1-year, $3.5 million deal. But he's going to turn 32 this coming season. He's entering those final years of his NFL career, and the Giants brought him in because the Giants are switching to a 3-4 system. Pat Shurmur's going to be the head coach, but he brought in the defensive coordinator from Arizona. So they'll be playing quite a bit of 3-4, and so the Giants decided to bring over Connor Barwin, and the Rams decided to let him walk, which, they got a lot of new linebackers coming in. At cornerback, Nickel Roby-Coleman was a solid nickel corner. Was playing on a 1-year deal worth $855,000. Was one of the better slot corners in the NFL. Great value at $855,000. And the Rams rewarded him with a 3-year deal worth $15.75 million. So a little more than $5 million a year on average, $8 million guaranteed to stay around in LA as the slot corner. Tyron Walker, a very important rotational lineman at defensive tackle. He was on a $775,000 contract, was only 27 years old, had 22 tackles, 3 tackles for a loss, and a sack. Those are really decent numbers, and so far it looks like the Rams are going to let him go. So, interesting move by the Rams, but they did bring in another defensive tackle, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Cody Davis. Cody Davis was a safety, a rotational player, not really a starter before he went on IR with a quad injury. He finished a 2-year deal that averaged $1.4 million a year, and Jacksonville decided to bring him in for depth and gave him 2 years and $2.5 million. Now let's take a look at the summary of all of the changes, and there were many, on the Rams team. Well, first of all, Tavon Austin is out, as well as Lance Dunbar. I think both those guys are a loss. I mean, to lose those guys, but they're not huge losses at the running back. Instead, they brought in John Kelly in the 6th round, but overall, it's hard to say that the Rams will be better at running back next season than they were last season. But look, hey, they signed Todd Gurley to a long deal, huge deal at running back. If he's healthy, you don't need a lot more than Todd Gurley. But you do need somebody. He can't play every single down. So at running back, there's a little bit less depth there than there was last season. At wide receiver, Sammy Watkins is out. He got a 3-year, $48 million deal with the Kansas City Chiefs. So how did they try to replace that production? Well, they brought in Brandon Cooks, who was a number 1 wide receiver originally with New Orleans, and then last year New England traded for him and got a first-round pick, or gave up a first-round pick for him. And then they kept him for 1 year and then traded him to the Rams for a first-round pick. So the New England was able to rent him for a year for not much. So that proved to be a pretty good deal for a guy who had 1,000 yards receiving, 7 touchdowns. The Rams, meanwhile, gave up a first-round pick for him and then signed him to a 5-year, $80 million deal. Wow. 5 years, $80 million. So that's what? Also $16 million a year. So these are two guys you're going to want to keep an eye on. Okay, Sammy Watkins got 3 years and $48 million, or $16 million a year. Brandon Cooks got 5 years and $80 million, or $16 million a year. And the question is, which one of these guys is going to do better from this point forward? That's what you want to watch. So far, you have to give the edge, in my opinion, to Brandon Cooks. He's had 3,000 yards, seasons. 3 seasons with at least 7 touchdowns. He averaged 8. But Sammy Watkins isn't far behind. Not too, especially considering he had that foot injury. But he had 1,000 yards and 982 yards. So watch these two guys. Because, let's say if LA gave Sammy Watkins 3 years and $48 million, or 5 years and $80 million, or whatever. Which one of these guys is going to be actually outperforming the other? And I'll tell you why this is such a big deal. Because the Rams gave up a first-round pick. They could have retained Sammy Watkins without giving up any draft pick. Right? So, they could have, Sammy Watkins was the free agent, could have signed with anybody, including the LA Rams. They could have given him 5 years and $80 million, or whatever it was, and they'd give up no picks at all. But instead, the Rams let Sammy Watkins walk and then trade a first-round pick to New England so they can get Brandon Cooks and then sign him to a similar size contract of $16 million a year. So will Brandon Cooks be a first-round draft pick better than Sammy Watkins? I don't know. It's very, very interesting. We'll see how their careers play out. It's going to be very, very interesting. At tight end, Derek Carrier out. He was the number 3 tight end. Never even had 150 yards in a season. Last year only had 71. But the Rams brought in Henry Krieger-Coble. He's a kind of a reserve player for some depth at that position. On the offensive line, the Rams drafted Joseph Noteboom in the 3rd round at tackle. And they brought in Brian Allen at center in the 4th round. And they drafted a guard, Jamil Denby, in the 6th round. So I don't know if any of those guys are going to be stepping in right away. Maybe Joseph Noteboom, maybe not. But there's some depth, I guess, for the offensive line. On defense, at defensive end, John Franklin Myers, 4th round pick. Sebastian Joseph Day, 6th round pick. They also brought over Ryan Davis, but will he play outside linebacker in that 3-4 defense or defensive end? That's an interesting thing to look at. But they brought in Ryan Davis. At defensive tackle, Tyron Walker out. Important rotational lineman. 22 tackles last season. But who did they bring in? Ndamukong Suh. Ndamukong Suh was let go, a little bit surprised, not so surprised, but a little bit surprising from the Dolphins. You can see his numbers started to tail off there quite a bit. from 72 tackles in 2016 down to 47 tackles. He's been a 4-3 guy. Not used to playing in a 3-4. I think he had serious reservations about moving to a 3-4 defense. But Wade Phillips seemed to assuage those fears. And they sat down, watched a ton of tape together, and he convinced them, hey, look, I know how to use you. I can use you in my system. And, hey, man, never doubt Wade Phillips, at least as a defensive coordinator, right? I mean, as a head coach, didn't always do great, but as a defensive coordinator, never doubt Wade Phillips. They also brought in Chunky Clements, who was a reserve defensive lineman, and then also Dominique Easley is going to be back. He tore his ACL for the fourth time, but in 2016 he had 35 tackles and 3.5 sacks. So defensive line certainly upgraded. I see. I mean, to have Ndamukong Suh next to Aaron Donald, if they can get Aaron Donald to come back, they got that contract dispute. Man, I will tell you what, that is going to be a really, really sick defensive line in LA. At linebacker, this is your concern if you're an LA Ram fan. Alec Ogletree out, Robert Quinn out, Connor Barwin out. Basically 3 starters out. How are they going to replace those guys? Well, these are depth guys. I don't know if any of these guys are going to be starting, but these are at least some depth, give you some bodies. They got Ramik Wilson, who was a reserve player last year, so he'll be on the roster. In addition to that, they have Ogbonnaya Okoronkwo. Okay, Ogbonnaya Okoronkwo. They drafted him in the 5th round. Micah Kaiser, they drafted him in the 5th round. Trayvon Young in the 6th round. Traven Howard in the 7th round. And Justin Lawler in the 7th round. That is a lot of rookies to play snaps in that 3-4 defense at linebacker. That is going to be every Rams worry. And if you're a team, playing the Rams, you've got to imagine you just run routes, short routes towards the middle of the field, and attack those young linebackers. That's where you got to be concerned, because the defensive line for the Rams is going to be so good that to take deep passes down the field is going to be risky, because you're just not going to have a ton of time to throw. If you throw a lot of deep passes, the Rams are going to light you up, because they got great cornerbacks and they got great defensive linemen who can get pressure on the quarterback. So anybody that plays the Rams is going to have to throw lots of short passes towards the middle of the field, and that might do it. We'll see. There's Connor Barwin's numbers. You can see they dropped off. Robert Quinn's numbers, not bad, but not as good as in past years. Look at cornerback here. Tremaine Johnson out. That was a big loss. And Kayvon Webster out. That's a decent-sized loss. But what do? They trade for Marcus Peters, who was a big problem in that locker room in Kansas City, but is a solid number 1 corner. He's probably every bit as good as Tremaine Johnson, if not, and then some. Aqib Talib, he's definitely still got some in the tank. Denver let him go and traded him. So to have a starting group of cornerbacks of Marcus Peter, Aqib Talib, and Nicole, Roby Coleman or whatever. Wow, you got really good corners. They also brought in Sam Shields, who missed most of the last 2 seasons, but he used to be a really good player with Green Bay. And also, they brought in Torian Nixon. So I don't know if I'd say I think I would say the Rams upgraded at corner, but at the bare minimum, they at least stayed steady. And then one last position at safety, Cody Davis is out. He was a backup player last year. And Maurice Alexander, who was also a backup last year. He only had 20 tackles in 2017. So, lacking a little depth there at safety. They lost some depth at safety. They upgraded on the defensive line by bringing in Ndamukong. They upgraded at corner, in my eyes. But at linebacker, wow, they gutted their linebacker core, and that's what you need to watch if you're a Rams fan. And, they got some solid wide receivers. They brought in Brandon Cooks. It is going to be really fun and interesting to watch the Rams this year and see how they put it all together. But if you're a Rams fan, you got to be excited. I mean, you almost have to think that they're the favorite to win the NFC West. Seattle really took a step back, lost a lot of really key players from their team. They traded away Michael Bennett. Maybe I don't know if they cut him or traded him, and then I think they traded him. And then they also lost Cam Chancellor to a career-ending neck injury. Cliff Averill won't be back. A lot of Richard Sherman cut him, signed with San Francisco. So San Francisco though looks like they, with Jimmy Garoppolo, they could give the Rams some trouble. So those are kind of, in my eyes, the two teams. I don't think Seattle's going to completely fall off, but I don't think they're going to make the playoffs. I think it'll be the Rams and the 49ers competing for that NFC West title, division title, and you got to think the Rams have the best shot at it. So it's an exciting year if you're an LA Rams fan. Let's see what happens. If you like this video, please click subscribe because we are going to have some of the best coverage of the NFL on YouTube. We're going to, at the end of the preseason, break down the final rosters of all 32 teams. And then each week we're going to review the previous week's games and also preview the upcoming week's games. So you do not want to miss it because there is going to be some great videos coming out about the NFL here on our channel. Thank you so much.